The morning my wife died, I made coffee for two. I didn't realize it until I was standing at the kitchen counter with both mugs in my hands, and the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming 3 rooms away. I stood there for a long time. I don't know how long. The coffee got cold. I poured hers down the drain, and I told myself that was the last time I would do something like that. That was the last time I would forget. I was wrong. I forgot every single morning for the next 4 months. Her name was Carolyn. We were married for 41 years. She used to say that she fell in love with me twice, once when we met, and once when she watched me hold our son for the first time in the hospital. This big man with rough hands trying so hard to be gentle. She told that story at every Thanksgiving. Every single one. And I used to pretend I was embarrassed by it, but I wasn't. I never was. Carolyn built the money. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because what comes later only makes sense if you understand that first. I was a civil engineer. I did well, but Carolyn had a mind for investment that I have never seen in another human being. She could read a market the way some people read a room. She started with the money her mother left her, $40,000, and over 30 years, she turned it into something that made our accountant laugh nervously every time we sat down with him. When she died, the estate was valued at just under $62 million. The house, the properties, the portfolios, the trust structures she had set up with a lawyer named Gerald Fitch, who had been her advisor for 20 years and who cried at her funeral, which I respected. She left everything to me. Our son's name is Patrick. He is 51 years old. He has my height and his mother's eyes, and a weakness I was never able to explain or fix, which is that he has always needed someone to tell him who he is. When he was young, that person was me. Then it was his college roommates. Then it was his first wife who left him after 6 years. And then, 11 years ago, it became a woman named Diane. I will tell you about Diane. Diane was 43 years old when Carolyn died. She was Patrick's second wife. They had been married for 7 years. She was attractive in the way that some people are attractive precisely, carefully, like it was a project she managed. She had worked in real estate before she married my son, and she had not worked since, which was her choice, and I never commented on it. What I did notice, and what Carolyn noticed before I did, was the way Diane listened. Not to you, past you. She was always listening for something beyond the current conversation, something more useful, something she could file away. Carolyn told me once, about 2 years before she got sick, that Diane reminded her of a person calculating a tip before the meal was finished. I told her she was being uncharitable. I think about that conversation a great deal now. The cancer came fast. Carolyn was diagnosed in February, and she was gone by October. In that time, Diane became very attentive. She called every other day. She drove Carolyn to appointments when I had obligations I could not move. She brought food. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to Carolyn talk, and I was grateful. I was genuinely grateful because I was exhausted and frightened, and I needed help. Patrick proposed the idea of moving closer in July. Carolyn was weakening by then, and the idea seemed reasonable. They lived 40 minutes away, and the back and forth was wearing on everyone. I said yes. We had a 4-bedroom house. There was room. They moved into the guest suite in August. Carolyn died September 29th, at 7 in the morning with my hand in hers, and the window open because she always slept with the window open, even in fall, even when it was cold. She said fresh air was the only thing that ever really helped her sleep. I closed the window after. The grief is not something I am going to spend a great deal of time describing because grief is personal and mostly unspeakable, and anyone who has lost a person they loved for 41 years already knows what it feels like, and anyone who hasn't cannot be told. I will only say that the house felt like a body that had lost its skeleton. Everything was still standing, but nothing held the right shape. Patrick was genuinely heartbroken. I believe that completely. He loved his mother. In the weeks after the funeral, he would sometimes just sit with me in the living room, not talking, and that was more comfort than most things people said to me. I want to be fair about my son. He is not a bad man. He is a man who does not know how to be in a room without someone directing him, and Diane knew exactly how to direct him. It started small, the way these things always do. She reorganized the kitchen while I was at Gerald's office for the initial estate meeting. When I came home, I couldn't find the coffee. I couldn't find anything. She had a system, she explained. It made more sense. She smiled when she said it. I put the coffee back where Carolyn had always kept it. I didn't make a production of it, I just moved it back. 2 weeks later, it was in Diane's place again. She began having opinions about the house that she expressed as questions. Had I thought about the living room furniture? It was quite dated, wasn't it? Not that it mattered, of course. Just something to consider. Had I thought about the back garden, such a waste of space? All those flower beds Carolyn had spent years on. Wouldn't a patio be more practical? She was only asking. She was only thinking out loud. I began to understand something. Not all at once. I am not the kind of man who understands things all at once. I am the kind of man who watches, who waits, who files things away, one small observation at a time, until the picture is complete. The picture took about 6 weeks to complete. What I understood was this. Diane had come into my home with a plan. The plan was patient. The plan involved managing my son's loyalty, positioning herself as the indispensable person in this household, and eventually making the argument to Patrick, to me, to whoever was listening, that a man of my age and state of grief should not be managing an estate of this size alone, that he needed help, that she was available to help, and that I should be grateful. I had retired from engineering 12 years ago, but I had not retired from paying attention. I spent 35 years managing projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars, coordinating teams, reading people, spotting the load-bearing problems before they became catastrophic failures. Those skills do not leave you. They go quiet. They wait. I called Gerald Fitch 2 months after Carolyn's funeral. I told him I wanted to review the estate structure, all of it. I wanted to understand every document, every trust, every transfer mechanism. Gerald was not surprised. He had known Carolyn for 20 years, and he had known me long enough to know that when I said I wanted to review something, I meant I was going to study it until I understood it better than the person who wrote it. We met 4 times over the following month. By the end, I understood the estate completely. I also made some changes. Quietly, legally, meticulously. With Gerald's guidance and the help of a second attorney, he recommended a woman named Sandra Okafor, who specialized in trust law and who had a handshake that felt like a contract. The changes took about 6 weeks to implement. I did not tell Patrick. I did not tell Diane. Diane's campaign, meanwhile, had become less subtle. She had identified what she believed was my weakness, which was my grief, and she had decided that grief made me manageable. She was not wrong that I was grieving. She was wrong about what grief does to certain kinds of men. Some men collapse. Some men become very, very still. She began talking to Patrick about my driving. Had he noticed, she would ask, just conversationally, that his father sometimes seemed confused about directions. She brought it up in front of me twice, the second time with a kind of practiced concern that I recognized from the project managers I used to fire, the ones who had already decided on an outcome and were constructing the evidence backward. She mentioned once, in what she presented as an offhand thought, that there was a very lovely continuing care community about 20 minutes from their house. Very high-end. A lot of retired professionals. She had taken a tour, just out of curiosity. She wasn't suggesting anything, of course. Patrick said nothing. This is the thing I have to sit with. He said nothing. I went and looked at the community myself. It was perfectly nice. It was also the last place on earth Carolyn would have wanted me to end up in while I was still capable of making my own coffee. And I thought about her when I stood in the parking lot. And I thought about August. And I thought about Diane reorganizing the kitchen. Then I got back in my car, and I drove home, and I called Sandra Okafor. The moment I remember most clearly, the one I go back to, happened on a Thursday evening in late January, about 4 months after Carolyn died. Patrick and Diane had gone out, and I was sitting in the living room in the chair I have sat in for 30 years, and I heard Diane's voice as they came in through the garage door. She didn't know I was there. She was saying, and at some point it won't be up to him, it'll be up to us, and we just need to be patient. Then Patrick's voice, low, uncertain, what if he won't agree? And Diane, he won't have to agree. That's the whole point. They came into the living room and found me in my chair with the lamp on, reading. Diane recovered beautifully. Patrick looked at the carpet. I said good evening and asked how dinner was. Fine, they said. Everything was fine. The next day I asked Patrick to take a drive with me, just the two of us. We drove out past the reservoir, the way we used to when he was a kid, when I was teaching him to drive on the back roads on Sunday mornings. He was quiet for a long time. I was quiet. We passed the old water tower and the Methodist church with the broken sign that has needed fixing for as long as I can remember. I said, "Do you remember what your mother told you when you graduated college?" He said he did. She told him that intelligence without integrity is just a faster way to fail. She had embroidered it on something and framed it, and he had kept it in every apartment and house he'd ever lived in. I had seen it on his wall as recently as Thanksgiving. I said, "I know what's being planned, Patrick." He didn't deny it. I'll give him that. He stared out the window for a long time, and then he said he was sorry. He said Diane had been so certain, and he hadn't known how to argue with her, and he had told himself it was for my benefit, and he knew that wasn't true. He said he was sorry. His voice cracked when he said it, and he is 51 years old, and he sounded like he was 9. I told him I loved him. I told him that was not the same thing as saying everything was fine. I told him I needed him to trust me over the next few months, and do nothing dramatic. I told him that things were going to resolve themselves, but that they needed to resolve in the right order. He asked what that meant. I told him he'd understand in time. Carolyn's estate had a formal reading scheduled for March, her attorney's process. Not legally required, but Carolyn had wanted it. She'd been specific about it. Gerald on one side, her wishes on the other, everything said plainly in a room with everyone present. She had always valued clarity above ceremony, and she had wanted there to be no ambiguity, no room for stories or reinterpretation after the fact. Diane had asked about the reading approximately 11 times since the funeral. She was not subtle about it. She had also, I learned from Gerald in February, made a phone call to his office asking whether spouses of beneficiaries could be present. Gerald had told her that was typically at the discretion of the estate holder. She had then, apparently, expressed her understanding in a tone he described to me as professionally cordial and personally alarming. Gerald has a way with words. In the 2 weeks before the reading, Diane was very kind to me. Attentive, warm, forthcoming. She asked about my needs. She asked if I was sleeping. She brought me coffee in the morning without being asked, which was new, and she lingered when she brought it, making conversation. I accepted all of this without comment. I had also, the previous week, asked Patrick to have dinner with me alone. We went to the Italian place on Morrison Street that Carolyn and I had gone to for 30 years, where the owner knows my name and where the corner booth is always held for us on Thursdays. We ate pasta, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. His job, a project he was proud of, a hiking trail he'd read about in Colorado. It was the best dinner I'd had since September. Before he dropped me off, I gave him an envelope and I asked him not to open it until the reading. He asked if he should be worried. I told him he should be patient. The reading was on a Tuesday. Gerald's office, downtown, 3rd floor, a conference room with a long mahogany table and windows that looked out over the city. I arrived first. Gerald was already there, with Sandra, who had joined as a secondary advisor on the amended documents. There was coffee on a side table. I stood at the window for a while and watched the street. Patrick and Diane arrived together. Patrick was wearing a jacket, which he rarely does. He looked like a man preparing for something unpleasant. Diane was wearing a gray blazer and her precise face, and she smiled at me when she came in. That measured, careful smile. There was a 4th chair at the table, and Diane moved toward it. Gerald said, gently but clearly, that the reading was for direct parties to the estate, and that he'd be happy to have her wait in the reception area. She glanced at Patrick. Patrick looked at the table. She sat down in the reception area. I noticed she did not look at me. Gerald began. He went through the preliminary documents, the estate overview, the asset summary, the trust structures. His voice was even and professional, and he had been doing this for 30 years. Then he reached the amendments, and I saw him glance at Sandra, just briefly, and Sandra was looking at the table in the same way people look at something when they are working very hard to keep their expression correct. Then Gerald read the amendment to the primary trust document. And then he stopped. He set the papers down. He took off his glasses and he pinched the bridge of his nose. His shoulders began to move. It took me a moment to realize he was laughing. Not loudly. Not performatively. He was laughing the way men laugh when they have been in a profession for 30 years and something happens that reminds them why they chose it. He said, "Arthur, you magnificent man." Sandra was smiling. She was trying not to, but she was. Patrick was staring at the envelope in his hands. Here is what the amendment said, in the simplified version that leaves out 40 pages of legal language that Sandra and Gerald had spent 6 weeks constructing. The estate was held in an irrevocable trust. It could not be contested, could not be transferred by pressure or persuasion or family consensus, and could not be accessed by any party other than me during my lifetime. Upon my death, the estate would pass to Patrick outright, and only Patrick, not to any spouse, not to any party connected to any spouse. The trust contained an independent oversight provision administered by a board of 3, Gerald, Sandra, and a retired judge named Helen Marsh, who had been Carolyn's college roommate and who Diane had met exactly once at a Christmas party 6 years ago. There was also a property provision. The house was in the trust. It could not be sold, leased, renovated, or modified without my written consent and the approval of the oversight board. Any current resident of the property who was not a blood relative of Carolyn or me had no legal standing with respect to the property in any capacity. What this meant in plain language was that every plan Diane had been building, every patient, careful arrangement, every soft conversation and reorganized kitchen cabinet, and mention of continuing care, communities, all of it was a structure built on a foundation that had not existed for 4 months. She had been measuring a house that was never going to be hers. Patrick opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. I had written it on the same Thursday night. I heard Diane's voice in the hallway, sitting at the desk in the study with the lamp on, and Carolyn's reading chair 3 feet away. The letter said, "I know this has been the hardest year of your life, too. I know grief makes us follow people we shouldn't follow. Your mother loved you completely, and so do I. What I cannot do is pretend that watching you choose silence over integrity doesn't break something in me. The money, the house, none of that is what this is about. What this is about is whether you know who you are without someone telling you. I hope, before too much time passes, that you find out. The door is open. But what happens next is up to you." He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He and Diane left without having lunch, which I had not offered, but which I had expected Diane to suggest. She was very quiet in the reception area. She did not smile when she left. For the first time since August, her face looked like a room where someone had turned off all the lights and gone home. Gerald and Sandra and I went to the Italian place on Morrison Street. Sandra had never been, and she ordered the wrong thing, and we told her the wrong thing was still better than most places' best thing, and we were right. We sat in the corner booth and Gerald told a story about Carolyn from 15 years ago, a negotiation she had walked into at the last minute and turned completely around in 45 minutes, and Sandra laughed, and I laughed, and for a little while the shape of things felt close to right. I drove home in the late afternoon, when the light was doing the thing it does in March, that low amber light that hits the tops of the trees and makes everything look like the last frame of something. I made coffee when I got inside. 1 cup. I sat in my chair. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about 41 years of watching someone be so much smarter and so much kinder than any situation required. I thought about October and the window and fresh air. I thought about what she would say if she were sitting in her chair across from me. She would say I was too hard on Patrick. She would also say she was proud of me, and she would say it in a way that meant both things were true at the same time. Patrick called me 7 weeks later. He called from a phone number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, he said, "Dad, it's me. I'm calling from a hotel. I wanted you to know I've spoken to a lawyer." I asked how he was. He said he wasn't sure yet. He said some days he felt like a person who had been reading a map upside down for years and had just figured it out. He said that was disorienting, but probably better than continuing to read the map upside down. I said that sounded about right. He asked if he could come for dinner sometime. I said yes. I told him Thursday works. I told him the corner booth holds 2 people just as well as it holds 1. He said okay. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I told him I know. I told him to bring a jacket. It's still cold in March. We are not all the way back yet. I don't think we will be all the way back for a long time, maybe ever, and I have made my peace with that. What I know is that the door is open, and the light is on, and the coffee is where Carolyn always kept it. And every morning I make 1 cup, and some mornings that is enough, and some mornings it isn't. And I think that is probably just what the rest of this looks like, and I think I can live with that. Carolyn used to say that a person's character isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do when they think no one is watching. Someone was always watching.